All right, well, thanks everybody for coming along. That's what you usually say at a seminar. Of course, we're in the evening and we're Zooming. So I'll try and keep it informal. This is a presentation, you may know, that was for a public audience and an academic audience in Canberra at the end of November last year, and it was during Social Sciences Week. And a version of it, a written up version, has now been published, and I'll show you that at the end. So look, my intention with this was to, I'll share a screen in a minute with some PowerPoint slides. My intention has been to open up the kind of conversation that might be had in anthropology and other social sciences about native title across the Australian continent. Of course, all of us know the practical role that anthropology has played now for many years in the actual legal resolution of native title claims, but this is a bit different. So my approach is that native title is a matter for all Australians. Firstly, in terms of relationships between Indigenous people and others, but also because native title raises some important issues for national identity and the broad population's sense of belonging. Why would we ask about Australian senses of place and belonging in light of native title claims? Well, my answer is that not to do so would ignore realities of everyday life, where in fact the rights of native title holders and other parties coexist. Briefly, it might help to further explain my interest in this question to note that lengthy work with Aboriginal people to map Indigenous cultural landscapes over many years has prompted me to consider parallels in my own life and reflect on my senses of connection to place and home. A good anthropologist examines how their own subjectivity has been influenced through learning about cultural difference, especially if, as in this case, the implications of that difference for the researcher's own life have been substantial. Hopefully you can see a single PowerPoint slide screen. Is that correct, Richard?
We've got the two of them there.
Okay, let me just try something. How's that?
That's it.
Right. So suffice to say that in my youth in suburban Brisbane, my memory is full of locally experienced places, street names, sports, parks, shops, tram stops, significant event locations, trees climbed, bikes ridden around streetscapes, and places to store cigarettes for an occasional teenage smoke. My boyhood mates and I spent time traversing a small creek that flowed behind the house of one friend into a substantial watercourse. This being a back way to enter our local football oval for early evening training and weekend games. With the perspective of an anthropologist, my sense of these personal, family and peer intimacies with locations that Canadian writer Don Gayton terms a primal landscape, part of a primal landscape, sits alongside a professional recognition of what Australian writer Don Watson has aptly termed the reckless indifference of a colonising mentality. Our youthful engagement with places was ignorant of the earlier Aboriginal cultural landscape we traversed. My archival work has established that my primary school was the setting for a substantial Aboriginal camp close to our local creek. 10 years before I began schooling, men present at an opening of the new school building had lived all their lives locally, and they recounted the displacement of the Aboriginal camp at the school some 63 years earlier in the late 1880s. And that's the modern landscape with the school, the Aboriginal camp, the watercourse, various historical locations and so on. But my awareness as a professional anthropologist of the reckless indifference to the Indigenous cultural landscape does not propel me towards the view articulated by some academics and commentators that lacking Aboriginal ancestry means being somehow cut off from where we belong. Persons who have necessarily lost the sense of the sacred, to reproduce two illustrative quotations canvassed in Peter Reid's historical research. Like Peter Reid, familiarity with Indigenous cultural landscapes prompts me to reflect on the different kind of emplaced identity enjoyed across the diverse locations of Australian life. Australian anthropology over many decades has focused on Indigenous rights in land and place, paying much less attention to those who are, quote, not the natives of choice, as it was put by American colleague Richard Handler when commenting on anthropologist Michelle Dominy's study of New Zealand high country non-Maori farmers. Recent work by Ussa Otterson in Alice Springs and Rosita Henry in the North Queensland town of Kuranda pay just as much ethnographic attention to non-Indigenous senses of place, home and belonging as to the Aboriginal people who share those social fields. I've actually never been quite sure of what anthropologist Clifford Geertz meant when famously stating back in 1983 that we are all natives now. But with others, the message would seem to be that worldviews across the globe increasingly overlap, with few cultural identities remaining completely insular. So how does the diverse Australian population, or segments of it, engage with place attachments? What is done intellectually with the ideas of emplaced identities proclaimed in native title claims? Or perhaps more accurately, what would, could or will Australians do with knowledge of Indigenous senses of place should it develop for at least some people beyond superficially consumed tropes and stereotypes? And I said in the lecture that a more manageable question was whether relations with land and place across the broad society potentially bear any resemblance to, or at least have any possible engagement with, key elements of Indigenous connections. So firstly, native title in legal significance. I won't dwell on this because most people here probably know a lot about it. There's much written and debated about achievements and failures in legal approaches to native title. The map shows that 40% of the continent has been subject to a determination, with another 25% currently under claim. We can note Marcia Langton's comment in the 2012 Boyer Lectures that the achievements of native title would have been unimaginable a quarter of a century ago. But I'm interested here in what this legal addressing of claims means for Australians who don't proclaim any Aboriginal or Torres Strait ancestry. I set aside societal responses where claims are seen solely as a threat. These include well-publicised anxieties about negative impacts on various parties' economic interests. I also note, but set aside, a complex politics whereby some Australians pursue, or at least acknowledge, reconciliation. A recent article by Tim Rouse and Anna Pertiera documents positive views, albeit cautiously articulated, with some uncertainty and apprehension. Their study finds substantial talk about how Indigenous difference poses compelling questions for the wider society. And we can also note Reconciliation Australia organisation's 2016 survey across all states and territories, finding that many non-Indigenous people, quote, wish to honour Indigenous Australians. But investigating factors influencing what is doubtless a broad and diverse range of such elicited views is complex. I agree with Rouse and Perdiera that addressing the emergence of an anti-racist, pro-reconciliation subjectivity is a much-needed advance on Ghassan Haja's proposed national subject portrayed as a paranoid nationalist. But just how far beyond middle-class urban Australia an articulated anti-racist subjectivity extends is, in my view, an open question for further research, with inquiries needing to be conducted well beyond the bounds of the major cities. But here I'm less focused on what Australians may think about Indigenous difference in general, what they think about failures and successes of native title claims. My focus is on potential overlaps between senses of place in native title and spatial constituents of a broad range of citizens' identities. What might we consider then as key aspects of the kinds of connections to place that arise in native title, with an eye to a discussion of both cultural distance from and yet overlap with sectors of the wider society? Now here I'm going to leave you to just glance through those. This is obviously a topic that I've worked on for many years and could expand on each of these dot points, but I'm presenting them as a brief summary of the kinds of issues that I think arise and become known about to some extent across the broader society through native title claims. I will say that the uniqueness of these elements of native title connections is often proclaimed, and one of my colleagues who is a respondent, and respondents' comments are also published from Tim Rouse, but the other colleague, Kevin Smith, who's an Indigenous lawyer with a big native title organisation, he proclaimed the uniqueness of these types of things in his comments. However, I think in my research experience and in much anthropological writing, each of these themes is complexly mixed with elements drawn from the wider society. That doesn't detract from the legitimacy of Indigenous relations with place, but it does indicate that the discreteness of place connections is in the native title era, qualified by many overlaps with the preoccupations, practices, beliefs, and economic life of the wider society. So with these aspects in mind, we can address Australian relations with place as distant from or overlapping with, or both, assertions of belonging in native title claims. Firstly, personal ancestral connections. Some Australian families trace ancestry to locations over multiple generations in this continent. Others, as we see from the graph, have relatively recent ties to place in other countries, the UK particularly being significant for many. At the 2016 census, nearly half the population, 49%, had either been born overseas or had one or both parents born overseas. These figures underline how many citizens may articulate senses of ancestral connection outside the continent. Genealogical tourism enables travellers to connect with the meaningful places of forebears' lives. Migration studies discuss the fluidity of senses of home, especially for those with relatively recent migration experiences. And I note in this article the extraordinary thing that migration studies and Indigenous studies literatures are almost completely separate in the Australian context. Yet they deal conceptually with many overlapping issues. One element of connection to forebears and an inherited sense of emplaced identity might be the location of their bodily remains. This would certainly mirror how burial places can figure as important loci of connection in native title claims. Popular accounts indicate that cemeteries, particularly locations where relatives are buried, are regarded among the general populace with reverence and a sense of history. Paul Daly, a journalist with The Guardian newspaper, wrote recently how he would be dismayed if unable to visit his parents' graves. That was in the context of his comparative musings about Aboriginal people hearing of Indigenous remains having been removed. Across Australia in recent decades, we've seen a rising popularity of cremation, which may or may not result in ashes being located in a known resting place. Scattering of a deceased's ashes might indicate a sense of sending loved ones to mingle in a place-less way with nature, a predisposition linked potentially to environmentalist sentiments, but the choice of where to scatter ashes to mingle with a global natural environment presumably is made with references to memories of what was a significant place for the deceased. And then I move to places of collective significance, collective historical significance, We have countless strategically placed monuments across Australia, reverence for places constructed to mark the memory of key historical figures. The monuments most in potential relationship and commonly tension with Indigenous connections to country are those representing the achievements of settler heritage. I'm sorry, I missed that slide indicating that places of accidental death are also something to be considered in this. An example from my fieldwork in coastal Queensland is at a town named 1770, where there's an impressive cairn honouring Captain James Cook. The monument stands on the site where one of Cook's crew carved the date on a tree where they came ashore. Every May since 1990, a reenactment of Cook's Landing has been staged as part of the annual 1770 festival. The area was added to the Queensland Heritage Register in 1996. My colleague and co-researcher Michael Williams, who was showing me part of his Goreng Goreng country, had at best mixed feelings about the monument, though we both noted the apparent enthusiasm from local residents and many tourists. Near the point looking out to sea was a location documented by archaeologists as part of an extensive shell-midden artefact scatter site, and the area also encompassed the vicinity of a memorial sign for a whitefella drowned while fishing in 2012. The location would seem to encompass multiple and rich meanings in the legacies of settler colonialism, including a significant but less publicly documented aspect of Aboriginal history. From a more remote region is the case of a striking statue produced with artistic license of Frederick Walker, commissioned by a pastoralist family to be located near their homestead in the Gulf country, a family with generations of historical occupation and productive cattle work in the region. Fred Walker might be understood as a deceased cultural ancestor of a sort for this station family and the wider community, who are certain in their conviction about their strong connections to the location of their cattle station and the broader pastoral industry region. In a separate interview, the male owner's mother, who came to the Gulf as a young woman with her husband in the 1940s, described the region as her family's home. noting that it is also the home of the Aboriginal families she's known for decades. And in the article, I talk about a quite extraordinary sense of cross-cultural familiarity in the Australian cattle industry, with overlapping senses of place. And in part, this due to a history of shared physical hard work. And I've written about this as well with colleague Richard Martin. As in the case of a remote cattle station, probably the most common setting for depictions of Australian relations with place is in rural regions. Farmers and others living in primary production areas can sustain long-term connections with the places they live and work, or where members of their extended families do. However, the realities of contemporary Australian rural place connections are more complex, and interdisciplinary research by my sociology colleagues at UQ actually has reviewed an extensive literature finding an agrarian rootedness in the land that can support a deep embedded connection to place, but with a distinction between what we can call embedded and elective forms of belonging. I will leave you to look at that. I'm conscious of time. The next issue is mobility. What about urban and regional town populations? Is a personal sense of connection to place relevant in those settings in a way that may lead citizens to recognise overlap or distance from the ancestrally, historically legitimated relationship to locations evident in native title discourses? Census data from 2016 tell us of considerable mobility. If we go back 5 years prior to the census, 43% of the population did not live at the same address. So if sense of place over time is linked to staying put and giving everyday expression to a habitus that facilitates embedded belonging, many Australians are too mobile. Of course, the primal landscapes of youth may nevertheless remain imprinted on individuals' sense of place, whether somewhere on the Australian continent or elsewhere. A further theme with potential overlap is the articulated ethic of caring for country. In light of widely known environmental concerns, including about climate change, it seems reasonable that a perceived overlap of environmentalist moral standing with Indigenous land ethics will be envisaged by some Australians. The slide shows the kind of well-publicised claimant proposition in native title about environmental consciousness that is presented in legal cases as part of traditional law and custom. Some Australians may well seek overlap with such sentiments to care for native species, but we see in the quote some difficulties arising. One is that there can be an Indigenous perspective opposing a national embrace of nature in national symbols, though in my research that's unlikely to be a predominant view. The other is the attribution of spirituality to species. The proposition that links even photographic or artistic images of species to some form of spiritually owned property seems unlikely to align with views of the broad populace. We also know that hunting, fishing, and gathering of bush resources involves killing species in ways that do not gel with significant elements in environmentalist thinking. An illustration is the public profile of Aboriginal rangers who receive training in science-driven concerns about feral species and pollution and work to mitigate those problems, but also continue to hunt and fish for food and celebrate the status that successful garnering of bush resources can bring in local communities. The slide shows Gulf Country Ranger Donald Bob with other rangers spearing a goanna while on a bush trip in 2016 as part of looking after country. And then there's the issue of nativeness, the idea of nativeness or firstness. The slide shows that, of course, native title is all about proclaiming that. So what does it mean from the perspective of the broad society to be not native, to be not first? Potentially less legitimately, therefore, connected through history and culture to place, land, and waters. Is this shrugged off as a symbolic issue, as with the formal acknowledgement of traditional owners, for example, at UWA in Perth, where the wording states that it is those identifying as Indigenous who, impliedly different from the wider population, quote, remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of the land. Though I haven't seen extensive empirical data beyond anecdote and media commentary, we can acknowledge there's some dissatisfaction from at least parts of the Australian population with the implication of being labelled non-Indigenous. That issue is noted, for example, in the ACT Council of Social Service good practice guides explaining terminology on Indigenous issues. Anthropologist Bruce Rigsby discussed, considering comments from poet Jeff Page that were prompted by Les Murray's poem, Not Indigenous, Merely Born Here, particularly Australians who are native born somewhere on the continent, may well think of themselves as Indigenous. This is to point to what we might understand as something of a lure of the idea of nativeness, noting that it is that in the social field of human identity politics, this is not always an attribute accepted as exclusive to Aboriginal claims over land. Now, in native title cases, it can be difficult to unravel such articulations from a political aim to contest the claimant's exclusively nativist rights to places. In the 1997 Yorta Order claim in Southeast Australia, a number of settler descendants, farmers, sawmillers, tourist operators and others gave evidence that they were people who were third and fourth and fifth generation landholders with considerable historical knowledge and connection to the places at issue in that claim. And you see a quote at the top there from one person, but there was an extensive body of evidence given by whitefellas in the Yorta Order claim. Now you see underneath that the court's ruling was to acknowledge the strength of attachment expressed on the part of non-Aboriginal witnesses, but to find that senses of place and belonging across the claim from those non-Aboriginal people was irrelevant to the legal question of a trial concerning Indigenous assertions of traditional connections to country. That's not surprising because of the nature of the Native Title Act. But my analysis is that it's possible to read the evidence as a cynical or deliberate mimicking of the Aboriginal claims. But reading the transcript, that's not my interpretation. If you stand back from the politics, there is no reason why both relationships of an enduring and rooted relation with the land do not coexist. In my view, and consistent with submissions in the claim, we should not be surprised that persons without an Aboriginal or Torres Strait forebear may give expression to the idea that they feel a kind of nativeness to place and land and relate it to what they see presented in native title claims. And in fact, there have been native title claims where Aboriginal claimants themselves, when asked, have said that they think that, for example, cattle station people also have a strong connection to the land. Well, briefly then, are there some tensions with native title that work against the wider society recognising elements of overlap, relevance and value in native title senses of place? Now, I have to summarise here, I think. The first is spirituality. Is there too much of it for an agnostic society? So in the article, I go through census material and other survey material discussing Australians' beliefs or lack of beliefs in various forms of spirituality, whether it be organised religion or other things. And it's a complicated story, as you might expect, with various fringe group positions, subjectivities, as well as mainstream churches, as well as, of course, a broad agnostic and atheist population. I discussed anthropologist Ken Maddox's influential article about sacred sites, which he said was a term new in Australian English and was being embraced by non-Aboriginal people in the 1990s, as well as Aboriginal claimants. I discussed New Age research and so on. But in the end, my assumption is that the majority of Australians do not see evidence of spiritual forces in landscapes, topography, the behaviour of animals and plants, or in regular dreams and visions of deceased relatives. All of those issues regularly arising in native title. Apart from views among a minority of environmentalists, Australians are not animus. Gender, in brief, there's a large literature documenting gender separation in the cultural traditions of Indigenous Australia. There's lots of debates about whether that embraces inequality or complementarity between male and female, but few would disagree that gender separation is a substantial feature. Now, the question is that a feature that would be embraced or favoured by broad sections of the Australian population committed to a particular version of feminism, opposed to gender separation, and so on? I give examples through the article, and at the least, it seems to me, diverse gender relations has to be something considered. And lastly, localism. Too much of it for a globally oriented society, and I work with the work of some philosophers, Jeff Malpass, discussing belonging and place in Australia and asking if the idea of it conflicts with features of modern life such as media, transnationalism, migration, diasporas, and so on. But with those philosophers, I tend to conclude that the localism and globalism clearly can be commensurate. So now I'll move briefly to some conclusions. Some people thought the conclusions in my Canberra presentation were the most interesting because, so I raise the elephant in the room that may emerge in the minds of an audience, including this one, academics, social science and humanities scholars very oriented towards the politics of this issue. What are the risks of addressing broad post-settler and post-colonial senses of place and connection in comparison to Indigenous discourses? Well, I state up front in my article that if there are such risks, my approach rests on the view that there are also benefits for cultural coexistence into the future in quite a practical way, which interestingly Kevin Smith, the Indigenous lawyer colleague, agrees with, though he doesn't agree he does feel it's cultural appropriation. And also, if there are risks, there's also the issue of whether it should constrain scholarly investigation. In the conclusion, I point out there's no shortage of criticism among academics for this kind of work. They don't like analytical recognition of non-Indigenous connections to land and place. Ken Gelder, a cultural studies scholar, dismissed Peter Reid's extensive writing as embodying an often bleary-eyed affective sentimentality that wants settler Australians not only to become Indigenous, but to supplement Aboriginal people in the process. Literary studies scholar Sheila Collingwood-Whittick goes as far as arguing that the human relationship with place is pathologised in settler descendant societies like Australia. Emily Potter, through a study of literature, finds Australians have, quote, unsettled non-Indigenous belonging, a failure on their part to adequately belong. Indigenous academic Eileen Morton-Robertson asserts that those without any Aboriginal ancestry remain migrants and diasporic, suggesting they can be understood only in relation to what they lack as non-Indigenous people. And you see another quote there from Anne Curthoys. While the writers I have in mind are curiously less openly sceptical, or at least more silent, regarding recently arrived migrants and refugees' capacity to develop embraced identities, there is a transparent political position implied in the writing which joins a dismissal of the broader society's connections to place with an express support for Indigenous rights, as if the two are mutually incompatible. My own view, likely influenced in part by those personal convictions I started with about positive senses of place and belonging developed with family and peers during youth, is that non-Indigenous emplaced identities and research that investigates and documents them cannot be reduced to an expression of what Gelder terms settler triumph, or merely a language of belonging used to obfuscate the history of Aboriginal dispossession, as another cultural studies scholar has put it. In this context, the issue I have sought to raise is whether Indigenous connections to place may achieve any degree of overlap with, and hence be culturally recognised by, those without Aboriginal or Torres Strait ancestry. Native title claims are a window for Australia onto possible, albeit in some ways unfamiliar, very unfamiliar in some ways, cultural landscapes. The somewhat basic data I've considered will require substantial research investigation through the lived lives of citizens, most of whom will likely have no opportunity for close social relationships with Aboriginal or Torres Strait people. The demography works against such opportunities for cross-cultural understanding and exchange of ideas. The abrasive cultural politics swirling around the issues may also limit how closely the broad populace might come to know about the kinds of place connections that are replete throughout Indigenous Australia. And as I've tried to discuss briefly, there are factors of difference that may limit recognition of ontological overlaps between the respective worldviews. But it's my view that research, particularly ethnographic research on Australian senses of place, in light of the significance of Indigenous connections to country, evident across the continent through native title claims, should receive greater attention in social science. The relatively sparse literature where we would expect to find such studies leads me to conclude that this is a potentially rich arena for original contributions to scholarship as well as to public debate. Thank you, I'll leave it there. The article is published right there.